Watch crime is increasingly a thing these days, with a watch reportedly being stolen every 30 minutes. In London, this criminal trend has received more than its fair share of attention, and sadly, this is with good reason. I'm not going to throw lots of stats at you here, just Google it. You really don't have to look very far online to see the various reports. And now, with the summer upon us, there are going to be more instances where t-shirts and rolled-up sleeves mean that the watches being worn are on display for all to see. So, what does this mean for watch enthusiasts like us who enjoy wearing watches? How do we navigate the fine line between style and security? That's what this video explores. It's my take on how I feel about it, the impact it has on me, and how that changes my behaviour and the watches that I choose to wear. I caught up with my friend Alfredo recently. He's a big watch guy with many Rolex, Patek and Audemars Piguet watches in particular. When I met him for breakfast, he was wearing an Omega Moonswatch, the Mission on Earth. I asked him what he made of the Moonswatch. I already have a pretty firm view myself. And he explained that it's a bit of fun, fine for walking the dog, and he said that these days, when walking around London, it's less likely to mean that he will be a target for watch thieves and muggers. And then he said something that really landed with me. I don't enjoy wearing my nice watches. I'm thinking about it all the time. Completely unprompted, Alfredo had put his finger on the very same issue that I wrestle with pretty much on a daily basis. I just hadn't ever expressed it that way. The mere feeling and the fear of being mugged for a watch on my wrist detracts from my enjoyment of wearing watches. As a watch enthusiast, I derive real enjoyment from wearing my watches, and yet these days when I'm heading out and about, the perceived threat of being targeted by robbers and thieves for a particular timepiece on my wrist interrupts my enjoyment and makes me stop to think. Arguably, perception is more important than reality. Regardless, it influences my behaviour and which watch I choose to wear. It's a sad reality and one that I'm still coming to terms with, even though I haven't ever had a watch stolen from me, and I find myself really resenting this. Presumably this isn't just a concern shared by Alfredo and I, hence this video. Losing a valued timepiece to a thief is one thing, but it's another to put yourself in harm's way. Because, of course, there's unlikely to be any debate. Robbery is different from theft because it involves force or the threat of force. I'm unlikely to get asked nicely to hand over my watch. The watch criminal is more likely to bash me around the head first, ensuring that they do a decent job of making their presence physically felt before taking my watch. So, wearing a luxury watch can not only mean that you lose your timepiece, but also that you might be physically harmed and probably emotionally scarred in the process. So, not only do I stand to lose a valued item, but by wearing certain watches, I might actually be putting myself in harm's way. They say ignorance is bliss. And frankly, if I wasn't aware of watch crime being such an issue, I might not ever think about it. And equally, I might never have a bad experience. In that sense, I feel the need to apologize for bringing this matter into the realms of your consciousness. For what it's worth, my watches are insured, and the higher value ones are insured for more than their purchase price. However, if I were robbed of one of my watches, given that many of them are limited editions, discontinued or hard to get, low production watches, I might never be able to replace it. But what are the chances of this happening to me or you really? Of course, I don't know. Sadly, however, much like my friend Alfredo, the perceived threat seems to be enough of an issue to affect me, how I behave and what I choose to wear on my wrist at any given time. And it leads to the inevitable question, by wearing a luxury watch, to what extent am I asking for trouble? There are many ways we might put ourselves in a situation that asks for trouble. Taken to the nth degree, you're unlikely to find me walking down the high street naked. Nothing good will come of that. In one sense, I might get away with it. I might not encounter any issues at all, but if I was to do something quite so daring, the risk of me finding myself sooner or later, in an unwelcome situation, is dramatically increased. So, what's the parallel watch example of walking down the street naked? Is it an Omega Speedmaster worth £5,000, a Rolex Daytona worth £50,000, or a Richard Mille worth £500,000? You might ask, what's your definition of a luxury watch? And which street are we metaphorically referring to? I suppose what you and I think is less relevant than considering what the criminals regard as worth stealing. When I think about watch criminals, I'm not really referring to the opportunistic thief or robber. I am instead thinking of the organized criminals, the ones that do this for a living and who train their gangs to recognize specific watches. I once read a newspaper article about a reformed bicycle thief who explained that stolen bicycle prices basically work out at half the retail value of the bike in the shop. So a £1,000 bicycle could be sold for £500 online or to a known or regular buyer. If he felt there wasn't at least £200 in it for him, then it wasn't worth the hassle or the risk. Presumably there's a parallel watch analogy to be drawn here. Following a similar logic to the bicycle criminal, I might expect watch criminals to look for high-value watches that are liquid or easily saleable to an identifiable buyer. A bit like the bicycle analogy, I'd imagine there's a risk-reward assessment made where, at a certain level, the likely reward means that it's not worth taking the risk. Last year, in Greater London, more than 6,000 watches were reported as stolen to the Metropolitan Police. The watches apparently had an average value of £5,188 each. Of course, this is an average figure and probably doesn't account for the stolen watches that are worth tens of thousands of pounds or more. Nor do I know whether this statistic refers to retail value or secondary market value. But either way, without trying to be too specific about the definition of luxury, I think it's safe to say that, taken at face value, on this basis, the vast majority of my watches are luxury watches. Mostly they've cost me thousands of pounds to buy, and so it stands to reason that, of course, by wearing a luxury watch, I might attract unwanted attention. But which watches are targeted most by criminals? I'd imagine that my Bremont limited edition watches would be harder to sell, not least because they're limited editions, and they're therefore less liquid. Consequently, they're less likely to be as appealing to a watch criminal as, say, my 39mm Rolex Explorer 1, which I dare say can be very easily sold without box and papers. So, arguably that's one way to lessen the risk of being targeted. Wear a Bremont! I've yet to hear of watch criminals targeting and stealing Bremont watches. However, in spite of the love and affinity I have for my Bremont watches, that still doesn't account for my mood, for what I'm wearing, or frankly, what watch I feel like wearing at any given time. Sometimes I just don't want to wear my least likely to be stolen watches, and instead want to wear something else that might have more appeal to the watch criminal, unfortunately. So it's irksome that the choice I make on any given day might make trouble for me. And just like Alfredo, that's the admittedly high-class problem I tend to wrestle with most days now. I don't enjoy feeling as though I have to wear one watch over another simply because of my fear of being robbed. It really irks me, and as I say, I resent it. This internal discussion leaves me feeling cold and not enjoying my watches as much as I used to, or as much as I'd like. I often hear it being said that people like how a watch flies under the radar, and I think that has something to do with their desire to avoid looking like they're high on conspicuous consumption, but to enjoy wearing the watch nonetheless. My Lange watches are a case in point. I really enjoy the fact that they're not particularly recognizable to anyone other than watch enthusiasts. I like that amongst my social circle, nobody really knows what the watch on my wrist really is. Sadly, I fear that this is not always reality. Watch criminals have been educating themselves as to what to look for, and whilst my circle of friends might be unaware of what I have on my wrist and its value, the watch criminals are likely to have a much better idea. I say that with some confidence because a former police detective told me that London watch thieves now specifically train their teams to recognise our Lang & Söhne watches, amongst others. He happened to mention this in passing, without knowing that I own Lange watches. So, whilst you might think that your luxury watches fly under the radar because they're not super ostentatious and not obviously Rolex, Patek or AP, the important thing to consider is that they know. And they, the watch criminals and muggers, are schooling themselves to know what to look for. On a recent trip on the London Underground, as I walked through the stations and travelled on the tube, I estimated that 8 out of 10 men were not wearing watches at all. The remainder were, but the vast majority of those were Garmin or sports watches or Apple watches and Fitbits. If you and I can't wear our best or highest value watches without feeling threatened or overly conscious, then what can we do as an alternative? Recently, having seen the Christopher Ward the 12 online, I bought the one in titanium almost straight away. It was a complete impulse purchase. And that was even before I had listened to all the positive noises from those who have gotten hands-on and actually seen the watch in person. I've never been interested in Christopher Ward watches before, but I really like the look of this one. The thinness, the integrated bracelet, the dial color and structure, the flag logo, and the fact that it's titanium. I only have one other titanium watch. In short, I really like what I have seen. However, in truth, my initial motivations were mainly driven by my wish to find an alternative watch option that would make me feel less of a target for watch criminals. I was amazed at the £1,600 price tag. It seems incredible for what's on offer. Consequently, my overriding feeling was that even if I received it and was disappointed, I couldn't really go too far wrong. My order of the 12 has the promise of a November delivery date. And if after I receive the watch, I enjoy it as much as I hope, then for those moments when I feel that wearing a Lange or a Rolex is unadvisable, I look forward to being able to shift my resentment and perhaps enjoy having an alternative watch option that isn't a Bremont or my G-Shock or my William Wood Red watch, without fear of attracting unwanted attention. I really want to enjoy it. Only time will tell if this hypothesis proves to be my reality. I do sometimes wonder if this is all in my mind, and that in spite of the reported watch crime, actually the chances of being robbed are rather slim, especially if one takes care and takes precaution. Britt Pierce's video references Rolex prices coming down, in some cases under retail, and I hope this has a dampening effect on watch criminality. But then I just used the H word, hope, which instantly dilutes whatever is in the rest of the sentence. Getting back to what the watch criminal does, stealing is one thing, the ease of selling is another. I mean, who buys these hot items? Who buys watches from questionable vendors? And how can it be happening on such a grand scale without organised insider cooperation? Of course, there's a system in play, but ultimately, an individual makes a purchase without box and papers. So there's also a shared culpability on behalf of those who buy watches without provenance. But, of course, also on behalf of everyone involved in the chain leading up to that moment, who helps to cool down or launder the stolen watch. Unfortunately, that might also include supposedly reputable platforms and auction houses. It's upsetting to think about, but sadly, that's human nature. You might argue that this is all about the odds of such a mishap happening, and that if you were to overthink the risks involved, you might, for example, never leave the house or cross the road. Isn't this what life is all about? There's always an element of risk mitigation. Again, it comes back to perception. And it did cross my mind when considering the purchase of the fake Patek Philippe Aquanaut that I might actually put myself in harm's way by wearing a fake watch. Brendan Cunningham wrote an interesting piece recently which is worth a read. Is antiquorum sufficiently anti-crime? He concludes, most auction houses take a professional approach, So there is some possibility that the industry, generally, is seriously approaching its responsibility to disrupt the cycle of watch crime. Doing so is in their own self-interest. If auction houses and other platforms gain a reputation for feeding the cycle of watch crime rather than disrupting it, it is likely that collectors will sour on luxury watches. The risks of becoming a victim, either through purchasing a stolen watch or having one stolen from you, would mean collecting is simply not worth it. Is there a chance that I might simply decide it's just not worth the risk of wearing my watches outside my home? Well, yes. Although I'm certainly not there. Not yet, at least. I still retain the mindset that suggests there's a spectrum of asking for trouble when it comes to wearing certain watches. Christopher Marinello, the founder and CEO of Art Recovery International, has said, "It's not a coincidence that the number of thefts runs parallel with the popularity of watches in general." So perhaps there is safety in Bremont watches and less well known and the not as popular brands like William Wood and hopefully the Christopher Ward 12 too. The latter two are not just well below the average stolen watch value in London, but also less well known and less popular brands. At least, that's what I'm telling myself. It's all rather sad and regrettable. Where I've ended up is assuming that in most cases, the watch criminals target watches that give them the least grief, are liquid and easily saleable for a decent return. I believe it's mostly the usual suspects: Rolex, Richard Mille, Patek Philippe and AP. But it might include Lange watches these days. As a watch enthusiast, it's disheartening to even be having these thoughts and conversations. I find myself having to make otherwise enjoyable choices based on security rather than personal preference. However, it's important to remember that the chances of being robbed are still relatively slim, and that not all watches attract the same level of criminal attention. At the end of the day, each of us has to make our own decision based on our own assessment of any given situation and our attitude to risk, and then make our watch choices accordingly. Ultimately, discretion is the better part of valor. How do you decide what watch to wear at any given time? And how do you downshift your watch choices? Does this leave you feeling somewhat resentful like me? Or do you now simply decide against wearing a watch at all? I'd really like to hear your own view. Please share in the comments section below. Thank you.